my name is Amy. What is your name?
Hi, I'm Sandy from Wilder Ranch State Park. I want to welcome you today. We are going to talk about the Bolkoff adobe, and actually it's part 2 of a 3-part series discussing the adobes in the Santa Cruz area. And the Bolkoff adobe was actually built in the first part of the adobe was built in the early 1830s, and we will talk about the remaining part of the adobe in just a little while. But again, I want to welcome you to Wilder Ranch, and we are here about 2 miles north of Santa Cruz, and we're not far from Mission Santa Cruz. And I know you already were able to see the adobe at Mission Santa Cruz with Julie, and the mission being started in 1791 was actually using this land, and at the time it was called El Arroyo del Matadero, and that was the slaughtering grounds because they were ranching out here, and they would use the cattle for beef, and they would also process them for their hides and their tallow, which was very important trade. They could make money from that with trading other countries and with sending it back to Spain. So while this land was part of the mission during the mission era, there was a young man named Jose Bolkoff who was a Russian immigrant. His birth name was Osip Volkov, and so he came by ship and actually jumped ship in Monterey. And being that he spoke Russian, he was able to learn Spanish and become very important to the to the Spanish government, which was still in control at that time during the mission era. And so Bolkoff rises up through the ranks, and he ends up marrying Joaquin Castro's daughter, Maria de Candida. And so when he marries, they have a family, and they live right here. But now this land, since the time of the mission, has now turned over to the Mexican era, the Rancho periods, and Mexico now has extended that land grant, and they are able to start a dairy ranch here. And so they are going to live and work right here, and this is going to be called El Refugio. And at this point. So while they're here, they are going to raise, I said, dairy cattle, and they're going to have some of the finest, sweetest, creamiest butter in the area. And that is going to be a tradition that will be carried on later by Moses Meter and his wife. And he came right at the gold rush era, right after the gold rush. He was a speculator, land speculator. He made money through wood and through other ventures, and he actually foreclosed on the Bolkoff, and they were not able to stay here, and that was in the 1850s. And at that point, he begins to improve the ranch here, and after he retires, he sells it to Dee Dee and Miranda Wilder, for whom the park is named after. And the park began in 1974 as a state park, and we hope that you all can come and visit us at some point. I would like to tell you a little bit about this spot physically, that the adobe, where the adobe sits, and this is prime real estate, really, because right here there used to be a creek, and the creek, the Wilders moved. They moved the creek because it was not as useful to them here as over further to our south, and that's because they built it underneath a barn, and they could use it more to their liking. But while the creek was here for many thousands of years, there were indigenous people, and people we call California Indians, living here. And the last group to live here was called the Ama Mutsun, and they would have called themselves that name, and they were part of the Awaswas, A-W-A-S-A-S, the Awaswas group, language group. And so this group, now scholars call them the Ohlone. They were one of the tribes in that group called the Ohlone, but they themselves are still around, and they call themselves the Ama Mutsun. And we're very proud that they are still involved in some of the archaeological projects and things that happen here. So I gave you just kind of a brief history just to go over it again. We started out with our California Indians, which were here for almost, well, we know more than 6,000 years, but right here we have artifacts dating back to 4,500 years that can best be directly related related to the Amamutsan. And so after the Amamutsan, we know that the mission was here, and the mission used this whole area, and we talked about that already. And then the Bolkoffs come. Well, I'm stopping with the Bolkoffs again because this is whom the Adobe is named after, and there's a reason for that. Actually, there was a second part to this adobe that you can no longer see. The Wilder family tore that down to build the 1897 Victorian home for their son Melvin, who was second generation Wilders living here. I do want to talk about this particular building, and that's because the part that's still standing was added on by Jose Bolkoff and his wife, Maria de Candida. And so they raised 17 children, but not in this house. They lived, we think, in an adobe that was closer to the day-use parking lot area. So for this adobe that still stands, we think this is the newer part that they did build onto an older existing part that I told you was no longer here. But that older part was actually used back for the vaqueros during the mission era. And again, I told you they were raising the cattle here. So that's what the original adobe was for. That's no longer here. But the adobe we see here looked different than it does today. And there's a reason for that. And there's a photograph or a drawing that you're going to see by Terry Quellen. She is a local artist, and she did that drawing, created that drawing. It's pen and ink. And she did that in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And she did that before a very famous earthquake hit, and that was famous to those folks around here anyway, the Loma Prieta quake of 1989. And so before the quake, there were no mesh fencing to hold up the walls, and there was no cement supports like there are now, but those were brought in afterwards to keep the building standing and to make it solid after the earthquake. But I do want to talk about the uses for the adobe. The adobe was used primarily by the vaqueros first, and then by family members of the Bolkoffs, of Maria de Candida. And one of her sisters lived here and later became a nun, and some of her other family members lived here as well. Once they left and the Meters came in and took over here, that was at a time when it was being pretty much used just for storage. No one really lived here until the ending days of the ranch and then into the state parks. It was just used for storage. But we do know by Berkeley, there was a group last summer that did an archaeological dig, and they actually took out sections out of the floor, and what they found was that it was dirt first of all, and then it was wooden, and then it was tile. And so they know that was what was covering the floor. And hopefully soon state parks will be able to rehab and furbish and preserve this building. I don't know if there are any more questions, but I want to again welcome you to come back to the adobe. I think I do want to add one more thing before we go, and that is about the building, the way it was built. It was not built traditional bricks, adobe bricks, but it was built with a earth ramming technology. And so wooden supports were built that were in the shape of a wall, and then they would take the adobe mixture, which would have had straw and possibly blood and mud, and they would have mixed it all together and baked them and made them nice and hard, and then they would have moved the wooden forms away, and these walls would have been upright and ready to go, and that's how they did it. So it was not done by brick, but it was done by that earth ramming technique. The tile, we think, came from the mission, and I think that was the only other things I wanted to talk about. So thank you very much, Hope Services. Thank you very much, and my name is Sandy. Hope to see you at Wilder Ranch State Park.